Good afternoon. Welcome, everybody. My name is Andrew Mertha, and I'm the Director of China Studies here at SAIS and Vice Dean of Faculty Affairs. It is my genuine pleasure to be moderating today's webinar, Hong Kong's New Security Law, Initial Assessment, Domestic and International Impact. After my brief remarks and introductions, each speaker will give a 15-minute presentation, and China Studies Associate Director, Madeline Ross, will gather your questions and raise them with the panelists, and we'll have a Q&A/discussion. Please use the Q&A function rather than the chat function, because the chat function has been disabled. So for your questions, please use the Zoom Q&A function, and note that the event will be recorded. So just when the situation in Hong Kong seemed like it couldn't get any worse, it does, and seems to do so over and over again. When contrasted with the Anno Horribilis of 2019, the Horribilia Annos Singulos of 2020 seems to be telling us that rather than a Tiananmen-style showdown, as many feared in the past year, Beijing seems to be squeezing out what made Hong Kong unique and special with a whimper through legislation. We've all been watching how this unique, vibrant social, economic, cultural, and political ecosystem has sought to find an accommodation with Beijing, even as the room for maneuvering has become more and more constricted. But my anxiety about this wonderful place where I lived from 1992 to 1994 is nothing terribly unique or illuminating for those of you attending. For that, we turn to our speakers. We're very proud to have two SAIS speakers with us today to analyze the volatile and quickly changing Hong Kong political and legal landscape. Ho-fung Hung is the Henry M. and Elizabeth P. Wiesenfeld Professor in Political Economy at SAIS and at the Krieger School at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. He is the author of the award-winning Protest with Chinese Characteristics and of The China Boom, Why China Will Not Rule the World, both published by Columbia University Press. Professor Hung appears frequently in national media analyzing the Chinese political economy and Hong Kong politics. He received his PhD in sociology from Johns Hopkins and taught at the Chinese University of Hong Kong and Indiana University in Bloomington before coming here. This fall, he's teaching a class at SAIS on the social origins of authoritarianism and democracy in Greater China. Our second speaker, Thomas Kellogg, teaches China and international law at SAIS, the course that will be offered in the spring semester. He is the executive director of the Center for Asian Law at Georgetown University and a leading scholar of legal reform in China, as well as Chinese constitutionalism and civil society movements in China. Prior to joining Georgetown Law, Professor Kellogg was director of the East Asia program at the Open Society Foundation. He holds degrees from Harvard Law School, where he was editor-in-chief of the Harvard Human Rights Journal, as well as a degree from Hamilton College. Without any further ado, it is my genuine pleasure to pass the microphone over to my colleague, Ho-fung Hung.
Hi, thanks, Andy. Thanks for organizing this very timely and terrific panel and inviting me to be part of it. So I'm going to do a brief historical introduction about the background of this national security law and giving some of my hypotheses or conjectures and actually an analysis about why Beijing is choosing to do it at a great price, I would see. And I think that Tom will follow up with the more detailed analysis of the text of the law and the implication of the law itself. First of all, that this is no doubt about it, it's a game changer for Hong Kong. That many people agree, and why it is a game changer is because Hong Kong, from the colonial time to the early Hong Kong SAR times, though it never had real genuine democracy, but at least it has the liberty. In the colonial times, the colonial government did develop a set of laws that can easily allow the police to arrest people for so-called illegal gathering, rally, protest, and outlawing organizations. So it is a kind of a colonial era legal apparatus that actually the colonial government, the British government at that time, was quite restrained in applying. So the law is there, but they didn't apply it very liberally, and particularly in the last 2 or 3 decades of the colonial rule. But the Hong Kong SAR government inherited many of these laws. Of course, that in the last few years of the colonial government, they try to undo this law to make sure that the HK SAR government would not inherit this colonial era law. But after the HK SAR government came in, they revived some of these laws so that police can have vast power to arrest people for protesting and for having organization that is deemed dangerous. Again, that in the early HK SAR era and the late colonial era, that the government has this law, but they didn't use it a lot, and they very refrained from doing it. But the law is there. So this national security law is actually similar in some sense, but actually more draconian than the anti-subversion Article 23 the law that the Hong Kong government tried to enact, legislated in 2003, but failed because of massive popular opposition. So what is different of this law, that is both the Article 23 and now the national security law, different from the old law that the Hong Kong government inherited from the colonial time, is that it can outlaw and arrest people based on not only their action and protests and organization, but also based on their speech, what they write, and even based on their association, that if they can charge them for conspiring with foreign forces, as we now know very well that they already have established some cases. So it is a kind of enable the government to arrest people for their thought, for their speech, and for their association, for who they're hanging out with, rather than just based on their action and organization. So it is a game changer. And back in 2003, when I was actually teaching in Hong Kong at that time, I witnessed the whole process. Not only just like this time, not only the dissidents or not only the political activists are against it. Back in 2003, that the key bankers, like even David Lee, who is a very establishment figures associated with the Bank of East Asia and allies of Beijing in the ruling coalition in Hong Kong, they expressed reservation about this kind of law, because freedom of speech and free flow of information is a very key foundation of a financial center. So they worry about this kind of law will jeopardize Hong Kong's status as a financial center. So at that time, the bankers are against it. And librarians, university librarians were against it in 2003 because if the librarians keep some book in the library that is deemed subversive, they can be in trouble. So it was a situation of 2003. Of course, now we know that we are now facing this law as a reality now, even more draconian. Perhaps Tom will get into that. And we already read stories about like public libraries in Hong Kong are taking down books for review for fear that they are violating the national security law. So the environment totally changed. And not only the content of the law, but the manner that they legislated. In the 2003, that they tried to legislate on the anti-subversive law by letting it go through the local legislature of Hong Kong. So it at least has a pretension of local autonomy. So they let the Hong Kong local legislature, though because of the electoral rule that it is nearly guaranteed that it is the conservative and the establishment politician always control the legislature. So they at least try to pass it locally as a local law. But now this time, it is the National People's Congress Standing Committee that basically in a very warp speed to finish the legislation process and then announce that it is going to be implemented in Hong Kong the next day. So it is basically imposition from Beijing directly. So the manner of this legislation is also very troubling. So it is the background and context, and as to why Beijing actually chose this time to legislate, to make this action with kind of a huge backlash and price that they are paying with all the sanctions from the US and from the international community, and then many countries are reacting by offering the pathway to political asylum and even citizenship for Hong Kong people that is going to have a deep and long-term impact for the viability of Hong Kong economy and business and on all other aspects of life. The conventional wisdom is that Beijing is doing it in a reaction to the 2019 protests. But I would like to add a more sophistication or complication to this explanation, because if it is just a reaction to the protest, that Beijing would have done it after 2014 Occupy. So because in 2014 during the Occupy movement, the Beijing is repeating this, has been saying that it is a vast conspiracy planned by the foreign evil powers and try to subvert the Hong Kong government and the central government. So all the rhetoric we hear about the protests in 2019 today, we already heard about it in 2014. But back in 2014, in the aftermath of the Occupy, the Beijing government didn't take this drastic step, but this time it did. So there is a key difference between 2019 and 2014. In 2014, the Occupy movement, toward the end of the Occupy movement, it started in September and it is ending in November. Toward the end of it, there is a clear public opinion backlash against the movement, against the protester. And university and journalist organizations have done polls in November 2014 showing that actually 80% of people are already saying that the occupation need to end. So they got tired of it. And in the election, after the 2014 Occupy, in the 2015 the district council election, for example, and district council election in Hong Kong is a very interesting election that really all of the seats are directly elected. But the district council elections, the area that elect one council is very small, that you can win the seat by having like 1,000 or 2,000 votes. So the district council election, though it is a direct election, but it doesn't have a lot of power. The district council mostly take care of issues, neighborhood issues, like fixing a water pipe and fixing a road, building a footbridge, and all these kind of mundane issues that the establishment parties and establishment candidates have been doing very well by establishing the patron-client network in the community. So it is always kind of a easy win for the establishment party. So in 2015, the district council election, that the establishment parties, as usual, won back in the election. They got 70% of the seats. And in the 2016 legislative council election, that in the directly elected seats, the Democrats did have some gain, but not a lot. So the establishment politicians also continue to have a kind of advantage in the traditional, in the district in which they have traditional strength. So the Beijing saw that despite nearly 3 months of occupation and protests, and the public opinion is not very much with the protester at the very end. And the election result confirmed the public opinion poll done in November 2014. So Beijing was not very worried about that at that time. But this time, 2019 is very, very different. As a public opinion poll done by the Chinese University of Hong Kong repeatedly, from the beginning of the protest in June to all the way to November, when the protests actually start to get violence involving Molotov cocktail, vandalism of Chinese companies and things like that. And the public opinion keeps showing that the public opinion is still with the protester. They don't mind the increased intensity and even violence of the protesters. And they are more angry with the government, more angry with the police. So the public opinion is very solid. So in November 2019, there was another district council election. And in October, there was already discussion about whether to delay delay the election because of the public order consideration. But in the end, reportedly, the liaison office and the CCP and then the establishment party decided to go ahead with the election because they are confident that the voters and citizens are tired of the confrontational protests, so there might be a public opinion backlash like in 2014. So the establishment figure can win back many of the seats. But to many people's surprise, including Democrats' surprise, in 2019, the election result is that the district council election result was that the Democrat won a landslide victory, in the end winning 85% of the seats, from less than 30% that they used to come out in the district council election. As I said, that it is a very conservative election that the establishment figures always win easily with vast resources in the community. But this time in 2019, the Democrats won a landslide. So it is a confirmation to the Beijing that despite the increasing confrontation and the protests in 2019, the public opinion is very solid behind the protester. So there's low public opinion backlash. And they start to worry about the legislative council election supposed to happen in next month in 2020. And the Democrats, after the big victory in district council, already starting to plan. Benny Tai, the famous law school professor in Hong Kong University, now lost his job despite the fact that he's got tenured. And the leader of the Occupy started to plan for taking majority in the Legislative Council, because the Legislative Council is divided into two chambers. One is the directly elected chamber. The other chamber is voted by companies and by conservative professional groups that establishment against CCP allies always find easy to win. But the Democrats, emboldened by the District Council landslide victory, they already planned for a strategy to win even the functional constituency half, that is not the direct election, half of the election, and then to attain majority of the Legislative Council in the schedule to happen in September this year. Then you see in March, the CCP newspaper in Hong Kong start to talk about color revolution in the making. The Democrats is about to seize power. And because the Democrats did have a plan, if they win the majority in the Legislative Council, they threatened to veto all bills from the government until the government came to the negotiation table to talk about democratization, political reform, and all that kind of things that Beijing didn't want to be discussed that soon. So it is already a roadmap to at least seizing half of the state power, as seen from Beijing. So it is quite a kind of emergency situation. You start to see the rhetoric of Beijing media start to shift in the mode of a kind of emergency situation, that in September, there's a real chance that the Democrats will win more than half of the Legislative Council seats, and then that will be amount to a color revolution. So they worry about it, and the public opinion is still highly in favor of the protesters. So it is why the Beijing really sense that there's a threat that the state power is in jeopardy, that its control of the governance in Hong Kong is in jeopardy, and the Democrats might actually gain political power through this electoral victory after victory. So it is the background that Beijing gets scared and then get very nervous about this change of color or a color revolution. So it is explained why Beijing adopt this very drastic and even very extreme, and I would say quite desperate measure to enact a national security law to keep the situation under control. And then you see that the latest development that I'm kind of running out of time, I guess, but the latest development is that the Hong Kong government a few weeks ago cited the third wave of the COVID-19 pandemic to delay the Legislative Council election for a year to 2021. So of course, other people are outraged that the US government reacts strongly, saying that it is taking away the election, scheduled election, and delayed for 1 year is kind of a political act, actually, to try to destroy the chance of a democratic victory, or to wreck the election in one way or other. Because if it is really the pandemic, then it should be delayed for at least at most a month and see what happened, rather than delayed for a whole year. So it is another indicator how they're scared. The Beijing is scared about the election and the chance of losing control of Hong Kong, like they lose control of Taiwan. So it is the background and the fear that I think drive Beijing to take this very drastic and extreme and desperate measure of adopting a national security law to make sure that Hong Kong situation is under control and they won't lose Hong Kong just as they lost Taiwan. Thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you, Ho-fung, for all of that extremely useful background. I'm going to try to delve a little bit more deeply into the passage of the national security law itself, the substance of it, and the implementation that we've seen thus far. First, I would say I agree with Ho-fung in terms of he called it a game changer. And I think that's very, very true. I think it's no exaggeration to say that the new national security law is probably the gravest threat to human rights and rule of law in Hong Kong that we have seen since the 1997 handover. And the implementation over the first 2 months of the law's existence makes me, anyway, even more concerned about where things might go from here in Hong Kong. I think the law is quite clearly designed to capture and to punish peaceful political activity, and that it's already had a chilling effect on activists and lawyers in Hong Kong. Some of the activists that I have spoken to in Hong Kong have told me that they are already having conversations amongst themselves. Well, can we do even basic political organizing under the law? What kind of contact can we have with the U.S. consulate and other consulates in Hong Kong? What kind of meetings can we have here in Washington or in London or Brussels without potentially running afoul of the law? So it's already causing people to think about exercising their basic rights. And I think it's quite clear that that is by design, and that Beijing will try to strengthen that kind of chilling effect element of the law in the weeks and months to come. First on process. So as Ho-fung touched on, the law was drafted by the National People's Congress Standing Committee in Beijing, and not by Hong Kong's legislature. That in and of itself is a violation of Hong Kong's basic law, its mini constitution, because under that basic law, Hong Kong is supposed to draft laws on its own, including on key issues like national security. So Beijing has sort of taken the reins from the Legislative Council in a way that is quite troubling for Hong Kong's autonomy going forward. I do think that the fact that they have chosen to draft this law on their own shows that they have lost confidence in the Hong Kong SAR government. The law is intended to allow Beijing to take control of the situation and indicates that they don't have faith in the Hong Kong SAR government to deal with the situation accordingly. They sort of watched, obviously, quite closely the events of 2019 and the anti-extradition bill protests morphing into a broader pro-democratic movement. And they felt, let's face it, not without basis, that the Hong Kong government was ill-equipped to deal with the crisis. And the national security law represents an effort by Beijing to take back the reins, as it were. And here I have a little bit of a disagreement with Ho-fung. I certainly agree with him that fear is driving a lot of Beijing's decision-making on the situation in Hong Kong and the decision to pass the national security law. But I detected, going back on it over the past 2 months or so since the national security law was passed, signals from Beijing in the fall that they were going to take action. And I think the potential to lose the September LegCo elections certainly fed into the process of drafting and then passing the national security law. But it may be, and of course we can't know for sure, it may be that that process was already in train in the last months of 2019. Let me say a word or two about the key elements of the law itself. I'll touch on maybe just 2 or 3 elements of the law. There's a lot going on in the law itself. If people want to raise other questions about other aspects of the law during the Q&A, of course, excited to talk about that. But I do think there are, again, 2 or 3 core elements that are really the backbone of the law itself. So first you have the substantive criminal provisions: secession, subversion, terrorism, and collusion. And as Ho-fung pointed out, all of these provisions are drafted in quite a broad and vague way, and are designed really to allow the authorities to sweep peaceful political activity up into those provisions. Law is meant to create certainty. Law is meant to sort of guide behavior and allow citizens to determine, okay, this is acceptable, this is unacceptable. The national security law, those 4 criminal provisions, work in the opposite way. They're meant to generate uncertainty. They're meant to make it difficult to determine whether any specific activity is legal or illegal, is covered by the law or not, and thus to curb a whole range of behaviors that may well not be within the ambit of what Beijing is willing to prosecute under the law. Ho-fung gave the example of taking books off the library shelves. I think it would be too embarrassing for Beijing to actually prosecute people for borrowing books or putting them on the shelf or what have you, and they probably would refrain. Never say never in this political moment that we're in, but they probably would refrain from prosecuting people under the law for going to the library, taking out library books, or librarians themselves putting such books on the shelves. But they've created such an environment, again, as Ho-fung noted, that people are asking questions even about that kind of basic sort of civil society activity. Again, that is by design. I think if you look more deeply at each of the 4 criminal provisions, you can actually discern the specific behaviors from 2019 that they are trying to get at, first and foremost. The collusion provision, for example, is clearly meant to sort of weaken bonds, if not break them altogether, between democratic activists in Hong Kong and their counterparts in Washington, London, Brussels, and elsewhere, meant to sort of take away the ability of the Hong Kong pro-democratic movement to seek solidarity and political support from the international community. If you look at the terrorism provision, for example, that's clearly meant to target protests that turn violent. And in fact, some of you may have seen in the news that the first prosecution under the national security law has gone forward, involving a gentleman who drove a motorcycle into a group of policemen. He certainly could be charged under existing pre-national security laws, but the fact that they are choosing to prosecute him under the national security law is meant to send a very clear political signal that they are really going to go after protests that turn violent. And of course, the secession provision meant to target even peaceful advocacy of self-determination or independence for Hong Kong. So we can look and see what their near-term goals are, but we can also see quite clearly from the laws that, again, quite common in mainland laws, that they have drafted them to be so broad that if new challenges emerge from Beijing's perspective, that these provisions could be used to cover those new challenges as well. The second core element of the law that I think is worthy of our attention are the new structures that are created by the law. Here, Beijing is really doing a frontal assault on the one country, two systems model, and creating mechanisms by which it can deeply insert itself into Hong Kong's governance structure, into its political structure, and into its police and prosecutorial apparatus. Take a look, for example, at Article 48, which creates the Office for Safeguarding National Security. That body is led by mainland officials and has a very sort of clear hands-on role in handling national security cases under the national security law. And I think it's quite likely that they will have a loud voice on key decisions related to when and whether to prosecute individual activists under the new law, and what charges to bring, what sorts of punishments to seek. So this is quite concerning, and I think it speaks to another challenge that Beijing saw as the 2019 protests went on, that the prosecutor's office, to a much lesser extent, the police, did in some ways serve as a backstop. There's been a lot of criticism, much of it deserved, for some of the decisions that Hong Kong prosecutors made regarding the protests in 2019, but they were not willing to just take on anybody. Certainly they were not going to arrest political activists in most cases, and we can talk about some of the exceptions to that. Beijing now has the authority, both with the Office of National Security and some of the other structures, to ensure that people that it believes should be prosecuted will be prosecuted. And under Article 55 of the law, it has the authority to have some of these cases tried by mainland courts. So Hong Kong's world-class independent judiciary could be bypassed in some key cases under the law, which, given party oversight and control over the court system in China, would mean that the party could dictate not just the decision to prosecute, but also the outcome of the case. Again, a very, very serious concern for all of us thinking about human rights and rule of law in Hong Kong. The other provision that I'll just mention in passing is the extraterritorial provision. The scope of the law is quite broad. It can cover almost anyone, anywhere, in a way that is quite unique in comparison to other national security laws from other parts of the world. And we can touch on that again more in the Q&A. Let me say a word or two about implementation before I turn it back to Andy and to Madeline. I actually have been surprised, and I'd be interested to hear Ho-fung's thoughts on this, about the aggressive nature of the government's use of the national security law in the 2 months since it was enacted. I had thought, or perhaps I could say I had hoped, that they would believe that the national security law could serve as sort of a sword of Damocles, if you will. It could serve as a loaded gun on the table, a clear threat to political activists and others not to cross any red lines, and that it could be quite effective even without being used. Now, of course, that chilling effect is there and is a key element of Beijing's strategy for taking control of the national security situation in Hong Kong. But they also want to make active use of the law itself, as we have seen over the past 2 months. We have something like 24 arrests under the law thus far, including as I'm sure many of you have seen, of Jimmy Lai, the publisher of Apple Daily, which to me indicates that they may well want to use the law not just to influence people's behavior and decision-making going forward, but perhaps, and I underscore the word perhaps, to punish political opponents who have angered them for many months, if not years, before the national security law went into effect. We don't know what sort of evidence the Hong Kong police have on Jimmy Lai. There hasn't been a lot of disclosure by the Hong Kong government on that front, but the nature of his arrest was indeed quite troubling, and certainly suggests the politically motivated prosecution. Ho-fung made a comparison to the colonial era in Hong Kong and the role that law can play in the colonial context. I think there's a lot to be said for that comparison. But another element of comparison, of course, is mainland China and the way that Beijing uses the law to target political opponents in places like Beijing or Guangzhou or elsewhere. This core element of what this law does is to take away some of the barriers to the use of law, the use of criminal law as a tool for quashing political opposition or even political dissent. And that's what I'm worried we may be seeing emerging in Hong Kong today. In conclusion, let me just say that all hope is not lost. I think we have a lot of activists in Hong Kong who are trying to think of ways to be as active as they can be, facing the new constraints of the law, and still looking for ways to push the pro-democratic agenda forward, even in the context of this difficult moment. I hope that they succeed, but of course, only time will tell. Andy and Madeline, over to you.
Thanks very much, Tom. Thanks very much, Ho-fung. You've given us a lot to chew on. Before we get to the questions that are coming through the wires, I wanted to kind of take advantage of this opportunity of being moderator to ask kind of the first question. And I guess my first question, I'm going to cheat a little bit by not really asking a question of my own, but I want to read you something from a piece from earlier this summer and ask you to comment on it in light of what you've been saying. So this is from Sebastian Weg, and this came out on June 27th of 2020, and he was trying to understand kind of what are some of the larger kind of political things in China that are leading to, you know, the national security law and by extension all the things that that you focused on. And he looks at kind of an intellectual and policy argument that I thought was quite interesting, and I'd like you to comment on it and tell me whether or not you think it's interesting too, or whether you don't, and why. So I'll read it here. This is, I argued that the critique of liberalism moved from the economic to the political field. That what he calls the new left neo-statists articulated three main ideas. The first is the superiority of political sovereignty over the rule of law. The second is a critique of the creeping judicialization of politics, meaning infiltrating China from the West, defining a need to repoliticize the state. And then finally, a critique of universalism, meaning that liberalism is only one guiding philosophy among many, leading to, he talks about Chinese exceptionalism, but I prefer to just kind of table the Chinese exceptionalism part of it and ask you whether or not this is something that, you know, is this kind of a rarefied academic argument, or does there really seem to be some meat to this in terms of what you're seeing unfolding in front of us? Ho-fung, do you want to go first?
Yeah, my quick response is that yes, I agree with him that the Beijing action on Hong Kong is not in isolation. It's not only about Hong Kong. You see the similar kind of behavior. We can see the similar kind of behavior over Beijing's rhetoric and action over South China Sea, over the reaction to U.S.-China trade war, U.S. Xinjiang, of course, and all other fronts. And you see during the pandemic, the wolf warrior kind of a diplomacy that sometimes the diplomat even unnecessarily provoke Western countries and media and things like that, say things that actually is not necessary to just to show that they can say it this way, they can talk about things this way. So it is definitely a kind of increasing nationalism and assertiveness that is actually related to the economic trend that, as Nicholas Lardy write about, the state strike back in the economic realm, that so the market economy is being more constrained now, and the state sector is expanding, and in all this kind of and then Make in China 2025 and all this kind of assertiveness, you can see it in all fronts. So Hong Kong is just one piece of the big picture. So I agree with Sebastian and many others who argue that it is a kind of to my view, it is a rolling trend on all the aspects of Chinese power in China and in the world.
So fun. Tom?
Yeah, just quickly on that, I think Ho-fung, summed it up quite nicely. Just if I can pick off the creeping judicialization piece, this to me is quite fascinating, that you have mainland intellectuals being mobilized to sort of launch an attack on the Hong Kong judiciary in this way. And when I came across some of these mainland Chinese scholarly writings, it was, struck me as quite nakedly utilitarian in the sense of, here is the one element of the Hong Kong political legal system that is least under Beijing's influence and control, and they are targeting that. That can't be a coincidence. And I think what you see is that is putting out some degree of intellectual justification, or at least an attempt at intellectual justification for the moves to undercut the Hong Kong judiciary, or even do an end run around the Hong Kong judiciary that you see in the national security law itself. Beijing obviously believes that if you want to get someone, or I should say, the party believes that if you want to get someone, you should be able to get them. I have struggled in some of my conversations with colleagues about the national security law to come up with any example of any political activist in mainland China who's ever faced a trial and not been convicted. And I've not been able to come up with a single example of that. I would submit that any activist in Hong Kong, any lawyer, any political figure who is shipped back to the mainland under Article 55 of the National Security Law for trial will be convicted. And the thinkers that Sebastian Page mentioned will provide the intellectual underpinning for that.
So it's not really something that's kind of retroactive and kind of just kind of a justification for something that's.
This is an ongoing battle. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that there is some intellectual heft here that is bleeding out over into the into the policy and obviously the political arena. Thank you very much.
That's right.
Madeline, do you? Did you want me to, let me ask one more if I can, just, and then I'll turn the floor over to Madeline. And that is, this is probably, so if the first one was a bit of an ivory tower question, the second one is much more of a meat and potatoes question. And that is, to what extent do the effects, the ripple effects of the national security law extend beyond Hong Kong? Geographically, virtually, what have you? I mean, what are the kinds of things that that we should be aware of? Either over here or people not simply not simply the people who are most directly affected by it, but how are people indirectly affected by that, and how should that give us pause?
Yeah, let me go ahead with a quick response. That we already read the newspapers report about this kind of a concern about how it reached classroom in the U.S., for example. As Tom already said, that the national security law has Article 38, which is actually more draconian than the national security law applied to mainland China. Actually, that the similar kind of law in mainland China applied to Chinese citizens committed so-called crimes overseas, or foreigners who commit crimes in mainland China. But if you are not Chinese, then you are saying things outside of China. You are supposedly outside the jurisdiction of that law. But the Article 38 of that national security law saying that actually basically anybody doing things that is deemed illegal under the law anywhere can be convicted. And then people speculate they just put it there as a threat rather than using it. But and I agree with Tom saying that actually that I'm also surprised that they use this law to its limit very soon. That in the kind of a first batch of wanted list of people under the national security law, including a guy called Samuel Ju, who is the head of a U.S. lobbying company. He's a U.S. citizen, and before he do this kind of a Hong Kong Democracy Council organization to lobby for Hong Kong issues in D.C., and he has been working in other D.C. lobbying organization for all other issues not related to China or Asia. So he's a United States citizen and lobbying his own government over some policy issue, but he ended up in the wanted list of the national security law. So it showed that they're serious to make foreigners doing things in foreign lands convictable by this law, and then of course that they cannot send some people to arrest him in DC, but if he get a plane connection, for example, flight connection in Hong Kong, so it is a possibility that he will get arrested, or in Thailand or any other countries that might have the extradition treaty with Hong Kong, then he will be in danger. It's why so many countries suspending the extradition treaty with Hong Kong now, that for fear that they will be used for this kind of purpose. So the implication is wide, and not only people in China and Hong Kong need to be concerned, and it's not only about politics, and as this kind of law, how this kind of law is applied in mainland China, that they well-connected businessmen, politically connected businessmen, or our government official use this kind of national security, state secret reason to take out or threaten their business rivals all the time. So people doing business in Hong Kong have some business relation with Chinese company need to be concerned as well that they will be affected.
May I?
Yeah, could I just make?
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah. Sorry, Madeline. I just make a quick point on that, if I may. I mean, I think Ho-fung is absolutely right that the case of someone like Samuel Chu is deeply troubling, and to apply it to the sort of classroom context, I think we all face a challenge in which we are mindful of the fact that Beijing is trying to influence classroom conversation in the United States, here at SAIS, and certainly at my other hat institution at Georgetown and elsewhere as well. And I think we have to sort of take the view that we, just as activists on the ground in Hong Kong, have as much freedom as they can manage to preserve under the law. We have as much ability to discuss these issues candidly and directly as we seek to preserve. So without minimizing the very real complexities that the law raises for both our mainland Chinese students and especially perhaps our Hong Kong students, we do have an obligation to have a candid conversation about these elements of the law and not allow it to sort of dictate a climate of self-censorship either in the US or elsewhere in the world. Sorry, Madeline.
No problem. We're getting a fair number of questions in, and so let me dive in. I'd like to ask both panelists to comment a little bit on whether you've been surprised at all by the foreign response. The American response, of course, but the British were one of the first to react very publicly. Is it what you expected? Is it lacking in what ways do you feel it could be different or should be different?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the U.S. response, I'm not very surprised because the U.S. The posture of U.S. toward China in this administration is always quite confrontational on all kind of issues, and this kind of national security law just created very good reason for the U.S. to put more sanction on Hong Kong and officials and things like that. And UK is an interesting case that you mentioned. That and actually not only its reaction about this national security law, but also 5G and Huawei. And it seems that we need some kind of study to see how the pandemic actually shift the UK government's posture towards China, that from having a leeway to allow Huawei and to develop 5G to more negative kind of approach to be aligned with the U.S. And then in Hong Kong, that UK is acting very swiftly. And then, as you know, that the very drastic measure that the Chinese government is protesting drastically is that all Hong Kong people who are born before 1997 and their family and can now have a pathway to become citizens. And it will involve, in the end, at most 3 million people, according to some estimations. So meaning that it is like open arms to all kind of Hong Kong citizens to move to UK. And it concerned Beijing because the people who will move to the UK might not just move by them with their body, but with their money as well. So there will have kind of a capital flight implication. And Australia is also doing the same thing, actually. It's another surprise that they're offering a more easy pathway for Hong Kong people to gain resident status and ultimately citizenship to Australia. And of course, then there's some kind of geopolitical and economic calculation. And Japan and Korea and Taiwan all eyeing to take away the financial center status of Hong Kong. And then they are luring the financial expertise and all kind of professionals to migrate to their countries. And then they see that when I hope it is not true that the ship of Hong Kong is sinking, then they want to take the talents from that ships to benefit themselves. And again, that I'm not saying that Hong Kong is sinking, that there's still a way to rescue it, but I don't have time to talk about it, but it is my take on it. It is both surprising and it's some expect from the perspective of US, not so surprising.
Thank you. Tom, did you want to add?
Yeah, just quickly. So I think Ho-fung, is spot on as usual. The only thing I would add is I feel some degree of maybe ambivalence or even sort of concern in the sense that I certainly would agree that the US, the UK, and other leading democracies need to respond to the situation in Hong Kong. But I think the Trump administration, perhaps in part for domestic political reasons, is now taking things too far with Beijing across the board, in the sense of closing down the consulate in Houston, having some of these state media journalists thrown out of the country, and giving Beijing a chance to throw New York Times journalists out of the country. It's no secret to this audience, of course, that the relationship between the United States and China has reached its lowest point, certainly since 1989. And so how in this environment do you try to say to Washington, and certainly to this administration, please adopt a level of nuance without having some folks, especially on the right, come out and say, well, Tom is pro-Beijing or some crazy thing like that. So, we have entered into a very, very difficult political environment, and the ability to have a nuanced conversation about China policy more generally in the context of a very, very grave crisis in Hong Kong has become that much more difficult.
While we're talking about the international scene, and I'd like to ask a question on behalf of Daniel Anaforian, who said, what impact, if any, will this have on cross-strait relations and on domestic politics in Taiwan?
Yeah, I mean, I could chime in, Ho-fung, unless you want to go first.
No, go ahead.
Oh, okay. No, I think this is a very sort of interesting question to be looking at. And I think, of course, many on this call today will remember the way in which Tsai Ing-wen was able to seize on the Hong Kong issue in 2019 as a major rhetorical stick with which to beat her political opponent in the presidential election. And she basically had a kind of come from behind victory that certainly, earlier in 2019 would have taken many by surprise. And so for the folks from Taiwan, this is obviously a clear warning and does even deeper damage to Beijing's reputation in Taipei. And it does make one wonder why Beijing is not doing a little bit more to calibrate its response to Hong Kong vis-a-vis its long-term political goals, with Taiwan. because whatever benefits they're getting from seizing control of the situation through the national security law in Hong Kong, they're paying a heavy price in terms of public opinion, certainly in Taipei and elsewhere in Asia.
Yeah, definitely that I don't have much to add, that we all observed that in 2019 Taiwan election, that really the Beijing action on Hong Kong has helped Tsai Ing-wen turn the table. That before the protest started, the Tsai Ing-wen was struggling in the pool, and people were worried about that she might be unseated by the KMT even in the Green camp. But with the protest, that she managed to pull off a landslide victory, and now the challenger, the Han Kuo-yu, is even recorded and voted out from his home city, and yes, all kind of any political party, any politician, even slightly perceived to be friendly to Beijing, is become a kind of a poisons and kiss of death. And I think that this situation in Taiwan has changed because of Hong Kong so much, so that that it is very difficult for Beijing to have its allies in Taiwan won't elect major election through electoral means, and the only hope that Beijing can influence Taiwan's election and public opinion is nothing short of military intimidation, at least. But with the history of the missile crisis in the mid-1990s to all the way that the Taiwan people are not quite easy to be intimidated. So it is a very tough situation from a Beijing perspective, definitely.
Yeah.
Here's a very interesting question from Ao Shun to both panelists. Under what circumstances do you see a situation where Beijing might back down from arresting more activists critical of Beijing? Would it be possible to reverse the damage that's already been done to free speech in Hong Kong?
Again, I agree with Tom saying that I share the exact same sentiment that Tom said, that when the law was enacted, I expect that they just put the law there to threaten people, intimidate people, to let people just self-censor, and that is it. But to my surprise, actually, they are very eager to use it immediately to its extreme, arresting or putting the Samuel Ju on the wanted list and arresting Jimmy Lai. It is a drastic step, but because he's well connected and he's well respected internationally, and it will create a huge backlash. And then, but already some people are speculating that Beijing already backpedaled a little bit, because when they searched the Apple Daily office and arrest Jimmy Lai, people prepare for the worst, that he might be transferred to mainland China, or because under the national security law, they can deny a bail and then keep him under arrest indefinitely, or even transfer to mainland China. But people prepare for this kind of worst case scenario. But after a few days, after 2 days, that he was released on bail and he was never transferred. And some people speculate that it might be already a sign of backpedaling, or actually, at least wait and see in response to this U.S. Action on this. So it is still, so that is still a room for the international community and for the protesters and politicians in Hong Kong to beat back the national security law by restraining the authorities' use of the law to not to apply it any further. And some people point out that it might already backpedal a little bit, but we will see. And I don't think it is a lost cause. I don't think it is a point of that some people might find it is already a kind of a Saigon 1975 moment. So it is lost, and then we just people as you can. So it is attempted to think this way, but I don't think it is that extreme yet. So it is still a chance to, if the international community and people on the ground in Hong Kong work in a kind of a careful way to beat back the implementation of the law, there's still a chance. Oh, and just a very quick addition, that because the people and the international community beat back this before, that is in October last year, they have the government of Hong Kong invoked emergency power to ban wearing face mask. Now it sounds ridiculous, but at that time, this law is against protesters who wear face masks. So they have this emergency law to ban all face masks. So the police has empowered to arrest anybody wearing face masks in late 2019. It is an emergency power that the government inherited from the colonial times and create outcry, and they arrest a bunch of people. And then later that they just sit there and then never arrest, and because it is not implementable. So it was beaten back, actually, effectively. It no longer valid. So it is an example that how a law looked draconian, but with huge pressure and defiance and international reaction, it can be beaten back.
if I can, I just wanted to follow up on one of the things that you said, Ho-fung. You had mentioned that this isn't a Saigon 1975 moment. So if that's not the right analogy, is there a more accurate or more correct analogy in your view of what's going on, or not?
It is a lot. Hong Kong situation is very unique and without historical parallel. Many people already talk about the Xinjiangization of Hong Kong, that massive internment and surveillance and things like that. And but I always say that Hong Kong is not like Xinjiang because Hong Kong is more complicated than Saigon because so many international financial firms and technology firms and all this kind of international presence in Hong Kong make it so complicated that it is like totally enmeshed in the fabric, economic, social, and political fabric of Hong Kong. So if really Beijing want to take Hong Kong in the way that law of Vietnam takes Saigon in 75, or they deal with Xinjiang, they cannot do it without risking a huge international conflict if they do it seriously. That it already did in some way with all this international backlash and sanctions. So it's why I think that they might be taking maybe 0.3 step backward to wait and see rather than going all out again. Then, but it is very unique situation with the international presence in Hong Kong. It is really difficult to really deal with Hong Kong in a way that they deal with other peripheral regions in China.
One quick point to add on that. I have tried to say to friends on the Chinese side that it's difficult to overstate the extent to which Hong Kong is reputation forming for Beijing right now. Obviously for Xi Jinping, the crisis in Hong Kong is issue number 5 or 6 or 7. Right, even at the most difficult moments of the crisis in Hong Kong, it's not going to rise into the top 3 in terms of issues that the Politburo is managing. And I think that may blind them to the extent to which opinions are being formed in the West and also elsewhere in Asia vis-a-vis Beijing's larger posture based on what they do in Hong Kong. And that sort of creates the opportunity to have a conversation. Certainly if we have a new Biden administration and a new, let's take a guess, Secretary of State Rice going to Beijing and saying, look, when it comes to Hong Kong, you're really, really hurting your own cause here. Whatever you think about the Trump administration's policy, the Biden folks can come in and say, we're willing to sort of deal with you in a more constructive manner. We're certainly going to compete with you on certain issues. We're certainly going to respond to dynamics like the situation in Hong Kong, but we also want to find areas to work with you, and you'll be making that job easier if you actually back off on Hong Kong. So I think that's sort of the play that a new Biden administration could make if and when they come into office in January of 21.
I hope those thoughts may come to pass at some level. We have a good follow-on question here from Ben Reynolds, and this was directed to Tom. How has the new law expanded the surveillance state in Hong Kong, and do you see any meaningful difference now between privacy rights in Hong Kong and on the mainland?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and thank you, Ben, and Ho-fung might want to chime in on this as well. So some of you may have seen the coverage of the fact that there are already efforts to sort of implement new rules for the national security law and sort of investigatory processes, investigatory powers for the Hong Kong police and other actors who are involved in these cases. You know, that trend of a separate set of rules and a separate set of processes that is weaker than existing Hong Kong law is quite worrying. And of course, we don't know what the rules will be for these Article 55 cases that are removed to the mainland. Are suspects going to be transferred to mainland Chinese police custody, in which case mainland Chinese criminal procedure law and investigatory rules or lack thereof would apply. All of that is still very much on the table. But I think it would be an overstatement to come back to the core of Ben's question to say that there's now no meaningful difference. We did have a ruling about a bail application. The first person who's being prosecuted under the national security law, that ruling came out a couple of days ago now. And you can read between the lines of the decision in terms of the judge trying to do the best that he can. Bail was denied, but it wasn't just a sort of blanket, well, the government can do whatever it wants under the national security law. And one hopes, one last point on this, if I could, one hopes that there's some degree of institutional reticence on the part of Hong Kong police and the Hong Kong prosecutor's office that will be involved in these things, even if they have to listen to some of their Beijing minders, if I can be blunt about it, on these cases. They may not want to adopt some of the no-holds-barred techniques that are in place on the mainland when it comes to electronic surveillance and other issues, but we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, I would like to add that another thing to observe is that the fate of all these social media and internet company that cannot operate in mainland China, but now can freely operate in Hong Kong. What would happen to them? That's I think Facebook and Google already announced that they are not going to hand over users' information out of request of the Hong Kong police with concern of the national security law. And then what the government in the long run would deal with this kind of in compliance of these international, actually US companies in Hong Kong, maybe will turn Hong Kong into like mainland China, that these companies has to choose between complying with the government's request of information or leaving Hong Kong altogether, or there's some middle way, or they can continue to be not in compliance and continue to operate freely as they have been in Hong Kong. It is something that we need to observe.
Okay, we have a question for you, Professor Hung, from Zetian Sun, and I'm going to just read it. It says, asking you to consider a counterfactual in which the establishment party would not lose the election, the upcoming LegCo. The changing political landscape after the 2019 movement is indeed a threat to CCP dominance. And he makes the point that every protest was countered by a very strong criticism from the CCP all along in 2019. Do you see any sign of that?
Yes, that is correct up to 2020. That observation is correct up to 2019. So 2019, that led to have some serious studies to look at what actually happened, fundamentally change Hong Kong, the social fabric and the people conception, because despite the protests from 1997 to 2003, anti-Article 23, and all the way to 2019, despite the increasing protests, you look at the election, the pro-establishment parties and candidates votes and seats actually creeping up even in the direct election. So they have been gaining headway. So it might have given the CCP some confidence that despite the apparent discontent and protests, that we managed to play the election game and to constantly gaining influence and seat in that game. But 2019 seems to have changed that. And another thing that is different, besides the thing that I talk about the public opinion and the electoral landslide, so they have correct concern. The CCP has the right concern about that they have a prospect of losing the legislative council. Of course, from my opinion, it is very difficult for the Democrats to win the majority, actually, because they have this power of disqualifying the candidate they don't like at will now. That's how do you deal with it? That they disqualify, just don't let you run. And but another thing that the CCP concerned about is that you observe about the public opinion that yes, the CCP always mobilized this post-establishment force from popular singers to actors and social notables and scholars on their side to voice concern and criticize the protester. They did in 2014 and 2019 they tried, but if you still remember that even Lee Ka-shing was under attack by Chinese official media in 2019, that they mobilized the tycoon to denounce the protester. In 2014, Lee Ka-shing and all these tycoon denounced with the reservation, the occupier. But in 2019, that Lee Ka-shing, like, I was traveling in Hong Kong, I buy the copy of the newspaper to see the front page act of Lee Ka-shing that day. Actually, it's very tricky, that it is a very ambiguity. Is that Lee Ka-shing ad is saying that, let's talk and dialogue, like something like violence is bad. And then there's a speculation. It's like a 50-50 blame assignment. So it is politically very incorrect for a tycoon like Lee Ka-shing. You should only denounce the protester. If you denounce violence and the talk about police violence is sky high, so it's look like that you are blaming 50-50. So and then the official media and CCP are attacking him for being not cooperative and not forthcoming enough to denounce the protester. And then some speculation in the social media in Mainland and some official tabloid saying that some rich people in Hong Kong might be behind the protester. They're conspiring with the US. So they even worry about the rich people, and for good reason, because 2014, the occupation is about direct election, about asking for universal suffrage. But the anti-extradition law, to begin with, many rich people in Hong Kong, including Mainland Chinese tycoon in Hong Kong, feel threatened by this extradition law. And so that is a good reason for the Beijing to suspect that some rich people and elite actually are kind of, if not behind the protest, but at least they are not, and some of them are even outspokenly to challenge the extradition law. So that the situation has changed. Even the rich people who has been very loyal allies of Beijing governance in Hong Kong seem to be no longer that trustworthy. So the game has changed. There's something fundamentally changed in 2019.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, can I just add one thing to that, Madeline, which is to say, of course, we don't know what Beijing's political deliberations are, but we can see from their actions, move after move after move, to inhibit or even crack down on pro-democratic political activists. Ho-fung mentioned the disqualification of certain LegCo members from running for re-election. Some of those who were disqualified are sort of relative moderates. So they are even now starting to go after folks who are very much in the mainstream of the Democratic Party or the Democratic parties in Hong Kong. And that says to me that they're just very, very nervous about their overall political standing. I mean, look, it's not too hard to read the larger meaning of postponing an election for an entire year, right? If they thought they had a shot of winning, they might say, let's postpone for 3 months, and then if we'll think we'll lose, then we'll postpone for another 3 months, right? I think this is the wrong approach. One of the things that I have picked up loud and clear in my recent visits to Hong Kong is that Hong Kong young people are just totally alienated by Beijing. I think there's actually an interesting parallel between pro-establishment political parties in Hong Kong and the Republicans here in the United States, right? The numbers for both are atrocious among people under 25. And Beijing is attempting to grapple with this problem by cracking down more and more and sort of trying to beat the people of Hong Kong into submission. That's not a good long-term strategy. So whatever benefits they gain from the passage of the national security law on July 1st, 2020, they're sowing the seeds for the next wave of protests that will happen. We can't predict when, but it will happen at some point. And I would wager that the key focal point of the protest will be some outrageous arrest under the national security law itself. And Beijing will have to deal with yet another political crisis in Hong Kong. So it's not a feasible long-term strategy that Beijing has adopted.
And we have a question for all three of you, I think. One of our last questions that we have time for probably. This comes from John Lipsky, senior scholar at SAIS. Do you have any thoughts about how this new security law is viewed on the street in the PRC mainland? And is the leadership going to pay a political cost at home for this? I think we all have seen that there's a lot of favorable reaction to it. But do we think that's the whole story?
Why don't you go first, and I'll go last, and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah. Ho-fung, you want to go first?
Yeah, I don't have an answer to it, and I don't think anybody has a real concrete answer to it. But I suspect, besides the nationalist rhetoric about in favor of this crackdown on Hong Kong, but it is a biased kind of sampling because only the in favor voice we can heard. But I would suspect that even some of the elite, rich people in mainland China will have a kind of reservation about the national security law, but not because of the national security law itself, but because of the international backlash and particularly the U.S. backlash and sanctions that it imposed on Hong Kong. Because it is not a coincidence that not long after the national security law, the New York Times have this story about all these kind of party elites' wealth stored in Hong Kong, and Hong Kong has been very useful in economically, financially, technologically. For China and China's lead Hong Kong more than ever now when we see that there's an imminent threat that many of the Chinese companies might be delisted from the US stock exchange. And after they lost the kind of a capital market in access to the capital market in the US, that they're actually the biggest capital market for them to raise US dollar denominated loans, and also capital is Hong Kong. So if in the long run it destroyed Hong Kong financial center, and then this Chinese elite and Chinese wealthy people and companies is going to be hurt themselves, and so from that perspective, I think they will if they are rational and they can speak their mind, that I would think that they would advocate the restraint. And also this national security law, just like the anti-extradition law, it looked like it will be used to go after the dissidents and political activists. But in the end, as we see how this kind of similar law apply to mainland China, that it will be used to go after rich people, to blackmail rich people, and including the Chinese tycoon in Hong Kong. As you see that the Financial Times last year report that many, there's a private dinner party with Carrie Lam among some kind of Chinese rich people who have a residency in Hong Kong, and it didn't name who, but they are actually actively lobbying against extradition law because they worry that when they used to be when they are in Hong Kong, they feel safe out of reach from the Chinese public security, but they can be reached out by the national security law. So I would see that there is a vested interest in the elite in the Chinese system that to see Beijing take a step back.
Thanks, Ho-fung. Tom, real quick.
Yeah, real quick. So, I think John asked an important question that I certainly don't have the answer to. I do speak to, of course, a lot of legal academics in Beijing and elsewhere, and I have the sense that they would be very against this kind of law. In some ways, this law is going to be more familiar to them than it will be to academics in Hong Kong, because there are so many elements of it that are mainland-like and that are sort of such a core element of what liberal academics in Beijing and elsewhere have been working against, for the sort of 30 plus years of reform and opening as part of the sort of legal reform project in China. They've seen that that project take a significant step back under Xi Jinping, and I would hazard a guess that they are sad to see a similar track being taken in Hong Kong as well.
Thanks very much. Okay, so we've got the tycoons, we've got the legal elite. So I'm going to speculate what I think the kind of the person on the street, might in mainland China might be thinking about this, to answer John's question, which is even more fraught than the two of you channeling those demographics. But my sense is, by and large, there's either support or basically an indifference. I think there's, generally speaking, Hong Kong can be a hard place to love, and there's no love lost, I think, among a lot of people within China. And this is something that I think Tom had mentioned, that Beijing, in a sense, reflects maybe kind of at least to the young demographics, what the current Republican Party might be grappling with. I think, just to extend that analogy a bit more, I think what we might be seeing of a lot of people in mainland China who even care about this issue is very much along the lines of the electorate within these kind of red state areas, which is that they're getting their comeuppance and it's about time, and something along those lines. So unfortunately, I don't think this is going to be there's a very kind of, I guess there isn't a broad-based set of opinions, let alone a coalition-building mechanism that could be really of any use within the mainland of changing the status quo, which is a somewhat less than fully optimistic note to end on. But I want to thank our speakers. I want to thank Madeline. I want to thank all of you who participated and joined this discussion. I want to thank everybody working behind the scenes to have made this possible. And I just want to say that we're going to be having many such events as the semester begins in earnest. And so I look forward to all of you continuing this conversation, starting other conversations, and just staying on top of these events as they unfold in real time and making sense out of them. So have a great rest of the day, everybody, and we'll see you all soon.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.